Guju, Nino Waviska Makwa, the nation cause, the Dodem, Makwa, Manitowash, the Dungeonbar, Ichikima, Ogamakan. I just wanted to do a quick video today because I got a call from one of our nation community members that there is a learned person out west who believes they're well learned and they have knowledge. I want to comment on knowledge of this culture of whiteness that the ethnologists talk about the colonial system coming in here, the all-knowing, all-wise people with their legal systems. Well, these learned people that are on Twitter and other places were hired by the government through their facility of their employment or contracts for universities to talk about various topics about Aboriginal culture, traditions, and which communities are real communities, like real Indians. Well, the first question that came upon me was, what is an Indian? Well, not that I'm a learned person of any note, but an Indian is someone who has their ancestry from the Indian continent, predominantly India, and they speak various languages of Urdu, I can't say that word, Hindi, Sindhi, and many other languages, including English. They're from India, but then that's the Eastern Indians now, and they've got Western Indians. Well, what's a West Indian? Well, that's the ones that they brought there as slaves to the Caribbean, and they're called Indians, but they're West Indians. Very confusing. Then in Canada, Indians are those who are defined as bands under the Indian Act. They're bands. They didn't delineate that they were Indians, except they said they were Indians under the Indian Act. So I guess they didn't come from India, or maybe they did. I don't know. I'm trying to be a little non-facetious or non-sarcastic, but this is important to put into consideration when we hear all this talk currently about pretend Indians. Well, I've never said I wanted to be a pretend Indian. I'm a Métis. Well, what is a Métis nation? Well, that's a question there, because the nations that so-called themselves as Métis nations, the Ontario Métis Corporation Political Lobbyist Group, that's a corporation. Supreme Court rulings say that corporations have no Aboriginal rights. They may have Aboriginal membership, but they have no Aboriginal rights. I can't offhand just remember which is one of the earlier Sparrow, Dalgamac, one of those ones, I'm not sure. The Métis National Council out west and the Métis of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta are all under the Métis National Council. Manitoba, they were defeated in battle, and they signed script, which is a treaty. So essentially they're treated Métis or script Métis, and they have rights that they got through the treaty negotiation process out west. Eastern Canada is a whole different ballgame. The Métis Nation of Ontario swears allegiance to the Métis National Homeland, which is west of Dryden in Ontario, so therefore they have no real rights in Ontario other than what the government negotiates with them. For whatever reason, they would want to negotiate with a political lobbyist group that they fund. Oh, there's the key. And under the Indian Act, they're all funded too. And the Assembly of First Nations is funded by the federal government. So it's all about the money. It's all about the money. And the control of the money and the fear that other people are going to take some money away from them. When we put in our original, our original claim, comprehensive claim to the governments of Canada, the Queen, United Nations back in February 11, 2009, we weren't asking for money. We were asking for our due rights to sit as an Aboriginal nation, Indigenous nation of Métis, mixed bloods, half-breeds, bastard Canadian, the Coeur de Bois, the burnt sticks. We have been here since the beginning of New France in 1608. We just wanted them to sign the treaty that they have in their laws, the Canadian laws. The Royal Proclamation was never removed or by the Crown. In fact, the Royal Proclamation was included into the Constitution of Canada in 1982 through the addition of the charter. So what we have here is that there's an Eastern Métis that we're supposed to be dealt with by John A. Macdonald after the Manitoba Act. They have not done so. In fact, the policies of the government of Canada since 1867 was to expunge and move through cultural and ethnic genocide the Indigenous population so they can rightfully possess the lands that they have stolen. In Ontario, Upper Canada, they actually had to buy the Rupert's land from Hudson Bay Company that basically they bought a stolen land because they never owned the land. They had just a charter from the Crown, letter of marque to practice fur trade. So the issue of Aboriginal rights in Canada are really being split by those who want to get a status card. So they're the pretend Indians who want to get benefits because they have an Aboriginal ancestor, so they try to become an Indian, or those who try to get their citizenship card from a political lobbyist group in Ontario, or somehow get hooked into the Métis rights of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and West. So there's a lot of confusion of who's what, when, and where, and how. But in the culture of whiteness, this is all exacerbated by the colonial system of suppression over since 1763 when the Brits took over the colony of New France. It's all difficult. And when we go into courts, the lawyers appear not to understand their own laws. In fact, we had one judge who said the Royal Proclamation was old law, it's not applicable. And another judge that said they hadn't read the Constitution except in law school. And they have no concept of Aboriginal cultures and traditions. They have no concept of what Aboriginal laws were, or basically what a nation is. The recent comments was that Asmin is a pseudo, sovereign citizen group, or they're not a nation. Well, a nation, on definition on the dictionary, is, I'll have to read this, a body of people having a common descent, history, culture, or language, and inhabiting a particular area or territory. Well, that pretty well explains what the Eastern Métis are. We were the descendants and are the descendants of the fur trade across eastern Canada. In fact, the Métis out west, Louis Riel, Gabriel Lemon, I've mentioned this before, are my grandfather's cousins. Most of the First Nations have French-Canadian surnames in their communities now, and most of them are my relations too, because my family was the first Métis family in New France that's recorded in the colonial paper trail from the marriage of Jean Nicolet with his Nipissing Huron wife from the Nipissing ancestry and the Huron ancestry. I've mentioned this before. They spent winter down with the Huron, and they shared the corn and the tobacco and the venison and the moose meat and fish from the north, and family making ceremony. And that's my ancestry. I'm the 9th generation from Jean Nicolet and Marie Madeleine Nicolet, his daughter. So, that's just 5 in oral traditions on that line. But that's just one of my Aboriginal lines. And we have a huge family. On our website, I think there's a name list that is huge of the descendants of Jean Nicolet. And we're all over Eastern Canada into the United States and out west. So what is a nation? A nation is a territory that has a body of people having a common descent. Well, we're all interrelated. We have a history, a very good history that the lawyers and the judges don't seem to understand, nor the politicians, which are mostly new immigrants to Canada, at least 1 or 2 generations, and have no knowledge of the history of Canada. We have our history. We have our culture and we have our language, even though it was suppressed, as you've heard about what went on in the residential schools, suppression of their language, etc. But we still have a smattering of our customs and traditions, and we practice them, and we have always practiced them. And so we are Métis of the East. Now, my family, most of them went out west. My family didn't go out west. We were part of the Wabashin Métis settlement after the War of 1812. Most of those people who came down from Dublin Island, a lot of them are my relations, right? So Métis rights, Métis culture, Métis identity doesn't come from one Aboriginal ancestor in the past. It comes from all your community that you joined together to be one as a nation of the original economic drivers of Canada. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the current judge at the Supreme Court says that these judges have to stop being advocates. And I won't get into that issue because it's too controversial. But a lot of the judges have their own point of view, and they don't know the history, which was identified in a lot of our court cases that are going up to the Supreme Court. So what is a Métis? A Métis by the Constitution of Canada and the Daniels case now says a Métis is someone who has an Aboriginal ancestor, self-professed to be a Métis. I don't have to have a government recognize me. They recognize every Tom, Dick, Harry, Mary, Jane, and Omar from around the world. You can be any race you want in Canada. They'll recognize that. They'll celebrate that in multiculturalism. They will give funding to all these different groups. And again, we've never asked funding. We want treaty because they're on our land and their own laws say they have to sign treaty. But they'll recognize all these other groups and bring all kinds of immigrants into Canada. But they won't recognize us. And our laws say, and their laws say, that we recognize ourselves. We don't need that recognition of the government. So anytime you discuss anything with the government, they say, oh, well, Canadian government doesn't recognize you. The word recognition is a functionality over time of the reality that only those ones that we want to deal with, have signed treaty with, or we want to negotiate with, we will recognize them to give them funding, like political lobbyist groups, which they require most Aboriginal groups to be corporations, because Canada is a corporation. So the whole laws of Canada are based on corporate law, not really on Admiralty law, and definitely not under Aboriginal customs and traditions. These lawyers, most of them and the judges that we've dealt with, have never read Delgamuck, never read Sparrow, never read Daniel's case, definitely didn't read Pauley case, and they haven't read Deschantel. That outlines very explicitly the rules and regulations that they're supposed to be following when dealing with Aboriginal people. They've also signed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and signed the Canadian Under Act. And that very specifically says that's what you were supposed to be doing. And they refuse to acknowledge it. And we've had recently one of the judges say that that hasn't been propagated yet. Well, obviously, it appears that the ineffective administration of the judicial system is very pronounced because the heads of the government are instructing their lawyers that work for the Crown, the judges that work for the Crown in various jurisdictions, what the laws are. Or the law societies are not instructing, like they get 1 or 2 days on Aboriginal law in law school, because it's all basically all about corporate law. And that's what we're dealing with as an Indigenous people. We have our customs and traditions, and we've adopted many things from the culture of whiteness, as the ethnologists say. We have adapted many things because adaptation is an environmental thing to go forward. You grab new things, bring it part of our culture. Just for example, the gun laws. Well, the Dutch and the Swiss brought guns in the 1500s. And we adapted it in our culture, guns. So they don't have now, this new group, Canada, come in, the rights to dictate to Aboriginal people the rights to carry arms. Now, we like to work in contemporary society because we've known that if we don't, we're going to get hammered in many different ways, legal, incarceration, etc. The horror stories are there. The media doesn't report, and you get all these quasi experts that try to say who we are and what we, and give us a definition of being a sovereign entity or sovereign citizen movement. We're not. We're indigenous people, and we have mixed blood. I'm not denying that. Very much mixed blood in me, but I'm Anishinabek, and many other Aboriginal communities are all my ancestors. So when it comes to what Aboriginal rights are actually what the Aboriginal nation or community dictate. And in fact, in treaties, it's not the Crown gives us rights, we give the Crown rights. And I'll go one last thing. When you go to the Treaty 9 in Northern Ontario, oh gosh, there's Native people there. We better go sign treaty with them. So they go for 2 weeks in canoes and line up the chiefs behind chairs and say, which one do you want to be chief? And then he signs a treaty. You see, it's people don't know these histories. They went a couple of weeks, I forget how many weeks, just canoes going up in the north, meeting these Aboriginal communities. Some of them weren't actual Aboriginal communities at the time, they just happened to be a fishing village, and made them sign treaties. And a few of them on the treaty signature of Treaty 9 and Treaty 9 and the edition in 2009, 1905 and 1906 edition. One of them wasn't even a community. And one of them, the community didn't like the chief that the Indian Affairs officer wanted, so they fired him, got a new one. So there's all kinds of history there, and no one knows this history because they don't teach it in school. So Aboriginal rights in Canada is very, very complex, and I'll give more videos on this later, okay? I wish everybody a wonderful day, and take everything I say with a grain of salt. Miigwech.